Hi, folks. My name is Dana. I'm a white, middle class, non disabled, straight, cisgender woman and settler of German, Polish, and Dutch descent who grew up on the traditional territory of the Susquehannock people in so called Pennsylvania in the United States. I'm currently a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia's Vancouver campus, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, unceded, and occupied territories of the Musqueam. My friend and collaborator on this presentation, Trevor Mack, is a filmmaker of Slekotin, Carrier, and Polish descent who both grew up and currently lives on unceded Slekotin and Secwepemc territories in what is now called British Columbia, Canada. Trevor and I have both organized with various social and environmental movements, including Extinction Rebellion, or XR, which seeks drastic and immediate action on the climate and mass extinction crises. In this presentation, we want to take the opportunity to reflect on Extinction Rebellion Vancouver and its attempts to mobilize for climate action in a settler colonial context. However, we want to stress that we are reflecting on our prior experiences as member organizers of Extinction Rebellion Vancouver and not on its behalf. To begin, XR has 3 core demands, the first of which you can see painted on the side of the pink boat in this image at an XR London protest: that governments and other institutions tell the truth about the climate and ecological crises. The second is that governments act now to stop biodiversity loss and bring greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2025. And the third is that governments create citizens' assemblies on climate and ecological justice. At the heart of XR's theory of change is the conviction that past tactics have not led to meaningful climate action. XR posits that large-scale, nonviolent civil disobedience, in particular mass arrest, is the only option left to overwhelm and win over police and force governments to respond to XR's demands. XR's seemingly uncritical approach to arrest and the police, and its problematic lack of diversity, particularly in key organizational roles, have been criticized by scholars and social justice activists. You can see just some of the critiques on this slide. This highlights the need to center an intersectional, critical environmental justice perspective, which shows how the climate crisis exacerbates already existing inequities that fall and intersect along lines of indigeneity, race, class, gender identity, sexuality, age, disability, and citizenship, among others, such that the impacts of climate change are differentially experienced. In this presentation, we'll focus on 2 specific intersecting systems of oppression at work in settler colonial contexts like Canada. Drawing on the words of Potawatomi philosopher Kyle Powys White, we refer to these intersecting systems as the capitalist colonialist matrix of oppression, which has led to the symptom of climate change. In this view, colonialism, which dispossesses and attempts to control Indigenous peoples, and capitalism as a system of property relations that prioritizes private ownership and profit, are separate but related systems that interact to support one another and to dispossess Indigenous peoples, degrade the environment, and poison the atmosphere with greenhouse gases emitted from extraction on Indigenous lands. Because of the very different histories and material realities lived by settler environmentalists and by Indigenous people, there is a tension in framing climate change in terms of a crisis or emergency, something that many settler-led environmental movements, including XR, do. As White notes, sometimes I see settler environmental movements as seeking to avoid some dystopian environmental future or planetary apocalypse. These visions are replete with species extinctions, irreversible loss of ecosystems, and severe rationing. Yet for many Indigenous peoples in North America, we are already living in what our ancestors would have understood as dystopian or post-apocalyptic times. Considering this, what is the role, if any, of settler-led environmental movements in dismantling the capitalist colonialist matrix of oppression in pursuit of climate action? We see an opportunity for settler-led environmental movements like XR to undertake deeper reflection on how to build toward what White, in the Yes magazine article you see on the slide, calls a decolonizing approach to allyship, an approach that both recognizes and confronts, quote, the resiliency of white settler privilege and involves directly facing the very different ecological realities we all dwell in. Based on the scholarship of White and other Indigenous and critical race scholars like Eve Tuck, Wayne Yang, and Sean Wilson, as well as our own experiences working towards building relations of solidarity on the ground, we suggest 3 principles or ethics for decolonizing allyship. 1. An ethic of relational accountability. Settlers actively learn about and challenge their privilege and are responsible and responsive to the communities with which they engage. 2. An ethic of care. Caring, consensual, reciprocal, and respectful relationships are forged with human and non-human communities. 3. An ethic of incommensurability. Settlers decenter or unsettle settler futurity or possible futures, and do not expect easy, comfortable, certain, or reconciled pathways to decolonization. They work alongside Indigenous communities in ways that support their aspirations and material empowerment, both now and in the future. So first, an ethic of relational accountability requires that settlers recognize their complicity in settler colonialism and the ways in which they benefit, and actively do the uncomfortable work of learning about, discussing, and challenging privilege and oppression. This is a critical first step for engaging in solidarity work among social movements who, as collectives, may not experience certain forms of oppression within the broader structures they seek to dismantle. An ethic of accountability suggests that, for XR to be accountable to and build alliances with racialized communities, it needs to seriously interrogate its view of the state, which throughout history has colluded with industry and economic elites to advance corporate interests at the expense of Indigenous peoples and those who are structurally oppressed. By refocusing its strategy on undermining the power of economic elites rather than on targeting or winning over the police and state, XR has an opportunity to better align with, rather than alienate, communities marginalized by indigeneity, race, and class, while becoming part of a larger coalition with the potential to undermine the capitalist colonialist matrix of oppression. Second, on developing an ethic of care. A key component of XR since the beginning has been what it calls regenerative culture, or a culture which affirms our connected roots to deep and abiding nourishment. A regenerative culture entails internalizing an ethic of care for the beings, lands, and waters that XR aims to protect. Bell Hooks has similarly described an ethic of love, conceptualized as, quote, a combination of care, commitment, knowledge, responsibility, respect, and trust. Hooks argues that without a concerted focus on embodying an ethic of love, or care, we're certain to continue operating with an ethic of domination that perpetuates systems of oppression. An intersectional ethic of care would therefore be, in the words of Sophie Bond, quote, aligned with the recognition of the violence and harm of the structures of contemporary global capitalism and ongoing colonialisms. This framing is spatial, relational, and situated, and is attuned to structural violence. So, while on the one hand, XR's desire to urgently address climate and ecological breakdown is necessary, on the other, it can perpetuate an ethic of domination that upholds systems of oppression, overshadows the different lived experiences of people and communities, and obscures diverse ways of being and knowing. In contrast, an ethic of care requires patience, deep listening, and fair deliberation. It's therefore necessary to more deeply grapple with the desire to take action and the need to center, listen to, and learn with and from those who have been structurally marginalized and remain at the forefront of environmental justice struggles. Third, building upon the foundations of accountability and care, we believe settler-led movements can enter into dialogue with Indigenous communities about supporting their struggles for self-determination. As Tuck and Yang say, there are, quote, opportunities for solidarity that lie in what is incommensurable, rather than what is common across radical movements' efforts. Cultivating an ethic of incommensurability requires settlers to work alongside Indigenous communities without centering settler futurity or the desire for certainty. In general, XR has and does mostly ally with Indigenous communities whose leadership denounces extractive projects that harm humans and non-humans, given that this aligns with XR's goals. However, within and between Indigenous communities, there exists an array of opinions on engagement with extractive industries, and XR will need to navigate situations where undertaking actions against climate and ecological breakdown might violate a community's protocols or its right to decide in favor of resource development. Given the diversity of views that exist within and among Indigenous communities, not all activism against extractive development will align with Indigenous people's wishes. Therefore, settler movements must become attuned to the on-the-ground realities and ambitions of local Indigenous communities through respectful and reciprocal relationships. Yet at the same time, they must be able to see and be highly critical of the structural conditions that undermine Indigenous peoples' jurisprudence and too often place their communities in the position of having to choose between present needs and future goals. In sum, by upholding an ethic of incommensurability, XR could enter into dialogue with community members to understand and honor their aspirations and needs without making assumptions or judgments about how those ambitions and needs should be met. But this is not possible without first establishing ethics of accountability and care. Ethics of relational accountability and care make it possible to work in solidarity with communities and to understand their present material realities and future ambitions, while an ethic of incommensurability mitigates eco-colonialism by unsettling settler futurity and centering Indigenous futurity. This approach to decolonizing allyship responsibilizes settler-led movements to actively support the calls to action led by Indigenous movements and communities right now, in ways that respond both to their current material realities as well as future aspirations. We owe this perspective to Indigenous leaders and scholars who can and do guide us in decolonizing our solidarity building efforts. In particular, we want to acknowledge 3 Indigenous land defenders, leaders, and friends: Elder Jim Layden, Stacey Gallagher, and Tawahum Beej, whose pictures you see here. Just a few days before this recording was made, they were all sentenced to prison by the BC Supreme Court for upholding their responsibilities to Coast Salish people and lands by protecting against the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion project. If you'd like to contribute to or share their support fund, please use the GoFundMe link at the bottom of this slide. Thank you very much. I'll just end with some references and suggested works.